out there, all my bookish friends in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Now, this episode is sort of based upon a request, and it's to do with authors from the Victorian age who you may never have heard of, or at least not read anything by. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? Now, the first author we're going to take a look at is a lady called Charlotte Riddell, or Riddell. Now, she was born in Carrickfergus, which is in Ireland, County Antrim in Ireland, and so under direct British rule. And her father was the High Sheriff of the county, would you believe? So that would probably give quite a spin on the way she looks at things. Now, Charlotte Riddell, she was actually very popular in her day. She was some of the best-selling books in certain years of the 19th century in Victorian Britain. And there's two things about her which you might want to know. So one, she was quite well known for some ghost stories, if that's your thing. It's not my thing at all. But you've got like names like the Uninhabited House and the Haunted River and Fairy Water, you know, those kind of things. So she does ghost stories which were quite popular, far more popular than her short stories were. But another thing about Charlotte's works was that they focus quite a lot on commerce, the effects of commerce, how commerce plays a part in our life. Commerce features quite heavily. And that's interesting because you don't get too many people focus on that, particularly British authors. In the early part of the 19th century especially, you wouldn't get it. Whereas in French you had like Balzac, who did his whole human comedy, in which money features quite a lot. But here we've got this lady, and I do wonder whether it's because of her background as being the daughter of the High Sheriff in County Antrim. You know, there's a lot of legalistic and monetary matters at the heart of all of that, so maybe that influenced her. So that's our first authoress, whom you may never have heard of, or may certainly never have read one of her books. If you have, leave a comment down below which one you read and how you found her. Our next author on the list is the rather colourful William Harrison Ainsworth, who hails from the north of Britain in Manchester, one of the industrial cities, which was rapidly growing in the early 19th century. Now, Ainsworth was really, really popular in his day, producing 39 novels. Now, he's got a great backstory, and one of the most brilliant life stories you can get for a novelist, and maybe I should make a video of him. But he's quite forgotten, despite the fact he was so prolific back in his day. And he was renowned for writing historical fictions, very gothic in feel, and something called the Newgate novel. Now, Newgate was a famous prison full of criminals in London, and the Newgate novel sort of glamorised criminals. It used to find the life story of criminals and embellish them into stories, and he was one of the great proponents of this, one sort of set the ball rolling with a few others. I think Jack Sheppard would be one of the more famous novels, the Newgate novels, for people to know, and the public lapped it all up. But Ainsworth, he loved his history as well. He had his finger on the pulse of what people liked and how to keep the page turning. And his first novel, which was a real success, I say first, technically his second, but the success was Rookwood. Now, the reason I bring up Rookwood is because you've no doubt heard the story of Dick Turpin, the highwayman, back in the early 18th century. Now, of course, Dick Turpin was a real character, but the glamorised, Hollywoodised sort of mystique, alluring, somewhat devilishly handsome, sexually charming highwayman bad guy, that image you have of him really comes down to Ainsworth's story Rookwood. Now, it's not about Dick Turpin, but Dick Turpin features in it, and a bit of his history is given, and it's glamorised so that people really fall in love with the idea of that baddie highwayman, who everybody really loves because he robs from the poor and gives to the rich, and he's good to ladies and all that jazz. That is from William Ainsworth Harrison. So have you read any of his works? If you want a really good gothic, over-dramatised, full of flair story, and you want to get familiar with what people loved in the Victorian age, then you should grab one of his books. In fact, Rookwood is probably a good place to start. Our third author in the list is Margaret Oliphant, not to be confused with the 2017 book Eleanor Oliphant is Fine. Margaret Oliphant was absolutely prolific. I think she wrote over 120 novels. And when you write that many, you evidently have quite a mass appeal for people to keep on buying. She was also a brilliant literary critic, a highly imaginative woman, a really astute brain. She was really a marvel. Now, it's interesting about her because she got married to Frank Oliphant, and he got ill and they went to Rome so that he could take the airs in Rome, but he died out there, you know, in the better climate. Didn't do him any good by the looks of things. And she never remarried, and she supported herself by writing, but she also supported her family. Her brother got into financial difficulties, and she decided to support him and his children by her writing. And she just had this constant output in order to produce the kind of income they needed. But she wrote for Blackwood's magazine as well, which featuring some absolutely brilliant criticism of literature and writers of the day. Again, I really need to do a video on her and her criticism, because actually I should do a... How would you like a section done on Blackwood's magazine and all the critical writing on literature of the Victorian days? Put your comments down below if that sounds appealing to you. But Margaret Oliphant, yeah, she produced a huge amount. There was a brief revival of her sort of in the later 20th century, but she's someone that everyone's forgotten overall. Miss Marjoribanks, you may have heard of that book. That's by Margaret Oliphant. Another famous one of hers would be Hester. I'm curious about the name Hester, because if you've read The Scarlet Letter, you'll know that the woman in that is Hester. And Margaret Oliphant had a few things to say about Nathaniel Hawthorne and The Scarlet Letter. But anyway, Margaret Oliphant is a big feature of Victorian writing. However, she hasn't lasted, despite her potential to have been great. Some critics have said she could have been another Charlotte Bronte or another Jane Austen, you know, that profound an impact on literature. He didn't say Jane Austen, he said George Eliot. But she never did. And Virginia Woolf said about Margaret Oliphant that it was a shame she sold herself to make money rather than by writing so many books, rather than making fewer books, which would have been really profound, and use her brilliant genius and insight into life in order to craft something that today would be a classic, a masterpiece for all time that would go into the Western canon. Some say that what she actually did was she prostituted her intelligence in order to make some, you know, filthy lucre. Which may be a bit harsh if you yourself aren't struggling to support a family when you're not even married in the Victorian age. She was also overlooked quite astonishingly and reprehensibly, I believe, when it came to the great literary canon of women writers amassed by, now what are their names? Two American critics. They're feminist critics, and the reason they left Margaret Oliphant out was she didn't attack the patriarchy. But that by no means should diminish her position as a great female writer. In fact, if you read some of her criticisms, it's because she held certain different views to the professors involved in making that list. But that shouldn't cancel you from being accepted just because you hold different opinions. But maybe I'll have to talk about that in another video. But anyway, Margaret Oliphant, if you haven't read her, then maybe you could rustle up a book somewhere. You're probably likely to come across Miss Marjoribanks first if you're looking. But grab one and take a read, see what you think. Have you read from her? Have you heard of her? Like I say, not Eleanor Oliphant from a 2017 book. Our fourth author on this brief list of Victorian authors who were popular in their day, but you may not have read any of their stuff now, is Lord Edward Bulwer-Lytton. First of all, great name. Second of all, he was offered the chance to be King of Greece. When the King of Greece died, someone came over to him and said, "Do you want the crown?" And he said, "No thanks. which automatically makes him a really interesting character. I mean, who turns down a crown? And he had, you know, quite a privileged life. He was a lord, but quite a colourful character too. Now, in literary terms, you will use some of his phrase. For instance, if you're in the USA, you may have talked about the almighty dollar. That's Bulwer-Lytton who coined that phrase. The great unwashed, talking about the plebeian masses, the commoner. That's his. And probably the most common phrase of his that's used today is the pen is mightier than the sword. That is also Bulwer-Lytton's writing. The full statement is, beneath men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword. And he wrote quite a number of works which had a real effect on people. People loved it. He knew what people wanted. Another person like Ainsworth, who had his finger on the pulse. It's actually Bulwer-Lytton who got Dickens, after reading Great Expectations. If you know, the original ending to Great Expectations, Estelle and Pip don't get together. Whereas Bulwer-Lytton, he read this and said to Dickens, "Do you know what, old chum? You should change that ending a bit." And so it's down to him that Dickens' Great Expectations, as we know it now, finishes the way that it does. He was rather insightful, very well read himself, very learned in history. But what's interesting about Bulwer-Lytton is his role on... He had an interest in the occult, which wasn't unusual in its day, but he also had quite a prominent role in starting the idea of the genre of science fiction building. I don't think he probably did it deliberately, but it would, you know, build from his time and with Jules Verne to being one of the most popular genres in literature. And he had this book called Vril, The Power of a Coming Race, I believe is the full title. Now, what's interesting about the Vril, they are this species of humans that live beneath the earth. So we're going on the hollow earth principle that used to be believed in. And there's sort of a superhuman race, and they're going to come back and claim the earth for themselves, and they're called the Vril. Now, what's so interesting about this is that title, the Vril, or those people, we actually see it in a staple of English culinary history, which is the small jar Bovril, which was used by infantrymen and lots of people during the war, because it's like a beef extract. Tastes awful on its own, but you make sort of beef tea with it. And bov, meaning, or bo, meaning bovine, so from the ox. But then they put vril at the end, meaning superhuman, makes you strong. And they took that from Bulwer-Lytton's book, Vril, The Coming of a New Race. So I thought that was a novel little tidbit of information. You never know, it might come up in a pub quiz one day. So yes, he had an impact in the forming of Bovril, let alone being offered the crown of Greece. Our fifth novelist on this short list of authors from the Victorian era is Rhoda Broughton. Have you heard of this authoress? The reason I say that is because, unlike what was said about Margaret Oliphant, that she was brilliant but she sold her brilliance to make money, and others who wrote sensationalist novels to make money, and maybe that's why they're forgotten, Rhoda Broughton was very incisive and challenged accepted mores and customs of the Victorian period. At this time, the latter end of the 19th century, of course, you've got the first wave of feminism building. And Broughton, she writes Faustina, which is all based on a new woman, the new woman, as they were known, what we would call the first wave feminists now. And so sometimes she struggled to get people to publish her works because they were objectionable, in inverted commas. Excuse that noise, that was just my computer going off with an alarm. Now, her uncle helped to get some things published to get her starting. He was none other than Sheridan Le Fanu, so you may have come across him before. But she wrote numerous things with a brilliant perception and angle on society, and I really, really should read much more of her. So I think The Game with the Candle was one of hers, and what's so interesting about that, it makes for a good contrast reading to Jane Austen's Persuasion. Because if you know about Persuasion and the way that's set up, The Game with the Candle is sort of inverted. Do you marry for common sense and for money, or for love? I'm not going to give much away. It's actually something you really should go and have a look at. And then she writes another book, The Beginning, which has got a great, I haven't read this one, but it's got a great premise to it. It's a young female author who she writes things, but then she meets a group of people who are tearing her work up, tearing the pages up, not knowing that she's the actual writer of them. Now, I don't know how this affects her, but I do know that apparently this was sort of foreshadowing future ideas that other authors would take, and she had a great influence on later authors. It's said of Rhoda Broughton that she was the greatest author or authoress between George Eliot and Virginia Woolf, and yet she's become almost forgotten. So, have you read any of her works? If you have, please put a note down below which ones you've read and what you would recommend, because as you know, this community is interested in getting the most out of the classics. So if you know something that's really worth reading, feel free to comment down below and let others know so that they can go and discover it too. Well, I hope you enjoyed that list of 5 novelists from the Victorian era who in their day were very, very popular. But for some reason have become sort of forgotten and overlooked. And I may come back and do another video on that, why certain works, although immensely popular in their day, haven't ended up in the great canon of classics, because I think there's something to be learned from that. So what did you think? Have you read any of the authors that are mentioned in this video? Do you intend to? Which one grabs your attention? Who would you like to read from? Can I also say that if you enjoy these videos that I make, please hit the subscribe button and make a like, because it really, really helps the channel more than you can imagine. Until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you are reading.